Welcome to What a Word is Worth. This is a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano, founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. And today, my guest is Mark Matousek. He is an award-winning writer, spiritual teacher, who guides us to our authentic self through expressive writing. His book, Writing To Awaken, is a guide, in my view, to move from personhood through transpersonal realms and beyond. He is also the author of Sex, Death Enlightenment, a true story, also The Boy He Left Behind, a man's search for his lost father, and my favorite title of his, When You Are Falling, Dive, Lessons in the Art of Living, a book that really, I can say, helped me through very difficult times. So there are other books by Mark, but I'm going to stop there and just welcome you, Mark.
Thank you, Marianela. It's great to see you.
Yes, it's wonderful to have you back here. We spoke a few years ago, but this is going to be a wider conversation. So I like opening with the question of how and when did you discover writing and its healing potential?
Well, I discovered that as a very young boy. I was in the second grade, 7 years old. I was very confused growing up in a house where there was a lot of trauma and danger and addiction. And I turned inward at a really young age, looking for answers to what was going on around me because I wasn't getting anything from the adults in my life. So I started to scribble in a notebook when I was in the second grade. And I wasn't premeditated in any way. I just needed a place that was a sanctuary for me to go inward, where I felt like I could say anything that I needed to say. I didn't grow up in a house where the truth was allowed. So I needed a space, which of course many people find in therapy, where I could be completely open so that I would know what I was thinking. Because as you know, particularly in very highly emotional situations, it's hard to identify what's going on inside. There can just be a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of upset, but not being able to touch on what it really was. So what I found, Marianela, was that when I wrote about my experience, I felt better. I didn't know why, but I felt better. And it was a very distinct shift. It was like a weight off my shoulders. I had some perspective. It was helpful to ask myself questions and then answer them on paper. And I've been doing that my whole life. I've really been doing that since then. I've kept a journal for over 50 years, and I am dedicated to this practice because it truly got me through the hardest times of my own life, and helping other people tell their stories has been hugely gratifying for me.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that the world have that you as a source. When did you exactly say, okay, this helps me, then I'm going to offer that? At what moment in your life did you see writing as an opportunity to guide others?
Well, there are two answers to that question. The first is, as a writer, I discovered memoir when I was in my 30s. I had been a journalist and an interviewer. And when I discovered the first person pronoun and I started writing about my own deep experience, I realized that there were 1,000 stories inside me that I had never told. And that if I could go deeply enough into those and tell them well enough, I could help other people to deal with some very dark material without losing themselves. If you communicate pain in the context of a narrative that also has many other colors to it. You can say very scary things on the page and people will be able to tolerate it, be able to take it in. So as a writer, it was in my 30s that I started to tell personal stories as a way of connecting on that level. And as a teacher, it wasn't until I was about 50 that I was asked to teach a writing class by a college near New York. And I didn't know what I was doing. It was just because I was an author that they had asked me. It was my first teaching. I didn't know what I was going to do. I walked in this room with a seminar of 12 people, and I've never had an experience like it before or since, that I knew what to do. I just knew what to do. In a way, even with writing, it wasn't quite as not rational. I understood it. I feel like I had learned a lot. I loved teaching from the first time I opened my mouth that day. The week was fantastic, and it just began a whole other track of my work as a teacher. Yeah.
How much do you think your spiritual background, though, facilitated that? Because in your 50s, you have already gone to India, right? You have had a whole life of opportunities and trainings with spiritual leaders from different backgrounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how much do you think that background, your trainings, facilitated the easiness with which you ask? Because I have taken your classes and you ask very daring questions in a very relaxed way.
I've been asking questions since I was a kid. I've asked other people questions ever since I was a very young boy. I was an interrogator. I was fascinated by other people's stories and how do you do it? And getting people to open up about their secrets. And I learned at a very young age that people love to talk about themselves and they like to be asked direct questions because that doesn't happen that often. So I've been doing that since I was a kid. So and as I said, I was an interviewer professionally. So I'm used to asking hard questions. I was very well trained for that. The piece that has to do with the spiritual development is that by the time I started teaching, my ego had softened. I wasn't trying to get ahead, prove myself, dominate. All of that was starting to settle down in me. So I think I was more available as a human being in general. And certainly as a teacher, I had more humility really at the time. You know what it's like. When you're 20, you know everything, and by the time you're 50, you realize you know almost nothing. So I came to it quite open, and I came to teaching at a time when I had gone through a lot of breakdowns, breakthroughs. I wasn't the same person, and what I find with teaching is that I don't feel like I'm doing it. And I don't mean to sound woo-woo, but it's not quite me. I come into a class, I don't know exactly, I'm prepared, but I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. And there's a flow to it that is transpersonal. It goes beyond my conscious mind. And so there's no fear, there's no self-consciousness. I have nothing to prove. I'm very clear that I'm there as a facilitator to really help people come to the truth of their own stories and what they tell themselves. I don't have an investment in being right. And I think when you get past that, there isn't the same kind of charge. So when I am direct with somebody in a class, they can see it's not coming from a place of competition, trying to be authoritative in any way. I'm a seeker on the path. That's how I teach. And I understand that we all have to move through our own stages of opening as we do. So I'm not trying to change anybody. I'm just trying to create an open space where they realize they have more courage and more insight than they realize.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And also, what I'm thinking, you said that very early on in your life, you were exposed to trauma and that you turned inward, but also, the passages between or from breakdown into breakthrough prepare us and actually, yes, work with the ego and softening it. I mean, Ruth King speaks, so eloquently about softening, and also harshness, right? Soften us. And when we soften, when the ego softens, then the encounter, right, with the other, or the myth of separation gets eliminated. So that facilitates the question. So, but let's go to Writing to Awaken, which to me is a true spiritual inquiry that guides us to finding the self among all of our parts. And so tell our listeners why one of the things that you point out, a revision of our personal narrative is important. Why can we just stay with the cultural givens we receive and just be happy? Like,
Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, first of all, it doesn't work. And the truth is that we all need at some point or other, if we want to wake up, if we want to evolve, if we want to be more free, if we want to be happy, we have to look at the narratives that are dominating our lives. We have to look at the contents of our minds, the stories that we're telling ourselves about who we are, what our lives are, what's possible, what isn't. And most people don't do that because they confuse themselves with their story. They don't realize that they are the storytellers, not the stories. And when you get that, it's a real wake-up call. When you understand that every minute of every day, you are creating a narrative, that we are homo narrans, we're the storytelling ape. That's what we do. It's how we survive in a mysterious world. We tell ourselves stories as a coping mechanism, as a survival tool. That's fine. No problem. The problem is that we confuse ourselves with the narrative. And when you're able to step out of it and look at it with some objectivity, which is what writing helps you to do, you can make changes. You can edit it. And you can understand that no matter how exciting your story is, no matter how comprehensive, it never really captures who you are. And it is something that's always changing. So that's why I like to say that when you tell the truth, your story changes. And when your story changes, your life is transformed, because many folks don't realize they're not telling themselves the truth. They're fairly honest. Most of us try to be fairly honest in our lives, but the fact is that we are reinterpreting and euphemizing and covering up and leaving things out all the time. That's how we cope as social animals.
Yeah, I remember listening to I forgot who did that interview for you, but I remember you talking about our tendency to manage our reputation, and that really got my attention, and the implication it has on authentic living. So what you're saying is or my question is, can we be happy while managing our inner and outer systems, or do we have to tell me?
Well, no, I mean, you're talking about reputation management, which is something that's one of the main reasons that we don't tell the truth. We're looking at how am I doing? What are they thinking? Am I being okay? Does she like me? All the things that are going on in the mind when we're in a room deciding what to say, how to present ourselves. And I don't think it's possible to be comfortable in our own skin when we're mind reading the room and when we're trying to, fit ourselves into what we think other people want us to be. They're counterindicated. To be ourselves, to be okay in our own skin, it means to be whole. And that wholeness comes from simply being who we are, as opposed to trying to compose a personality or an identity that's acceptable to other people. So many people I work with spend half of their life, trying to please somebody, trying to be accepted, trying to belong, and wondering why they never feel at peace, even when they're accepted. Because that ego that's hungry for that insecure identity is never satisfied.
It's insatiable.
And it's inherently insecure.
Absolutely. And it is a part. I mean, I do work with the psychology of parts, right? And we know that while the parts are in charge, there is always going to be strong reactions that are all disease. So I think the part that is managing the reputation is a part that is probably a protector, a very strong reactive one, I will say, or proactive, I don't know, but it's definitely trying to protect. And there is a lot of unhappiness there. I agree with you, and I'm so glad. But I was saying before, when I heard you, you have a way to to capture things and to kind of create labels that make sense. That when we hear them, we said, oh, yeah. Because when I heard that, oh, yes, that is so true. The reputation manager is so active.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. It's huge. Whether you're sitting with your spouse, I mean, it could be sitting with a dear friend or a spouse or family or meeting a group of strangers. Who am I going to be?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And it's the shape shifting self. And
Complete.
like I said, that in itself is not necessarily harmful. It's not knowing that we're doing it. Because of
Correct.
course we move through our lives, we play different roles. You know, you're not the same sitting here talking to me as you are with a client, as you are with your spouse, as you are with your therapist or your priest. You know, we play different roles. We say different things. There are different boundaries and different languages that we use in different circumstances. That's absolutely fine. When
Yeah.
we lose ourselves in it and we don't understand that we are the awareness behind it, that
Mhm.
is that is navigating and that is coordinating it, that's when we lose ourselves in the projections and
Right.
the identity, and that's when we are that leads to unhappiness.
And that's the work. Now you describe writing as a use of the imagination that then enables us to reinvent our stories from fragments of our memories, right? We are always going back to the memory bank. And so you said specifically one thing that caught my attention, and I want you to say more. You said something like, how we remember things is often more important than what actually happened. So my question is, does that also apply to traumatic memories?
Absolutely. And that I'm taking from James Hillman, the great Jungian psychologist, who said our lives are determined less by what happened to us than by how we remember what happened to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bessel van der Kolk, the
Yes.
trauma specialist, says the difference between people who heal from trauma and people who tend to be stuck is the ability to change the story.
Mm-hmm.
So if we are not able to question our interpretation of the past, we are stuck in the past, and we're caught in that version of things and doomed to keep repeating it. But being able to question the story doesn't mean that what happened didn't happen. We're not questioning that. We're questioning how we hold it.
Mm-hmm.
This goes to the point about telling story, because of course we tell stories about our past as well, and we have a choice of what those stories are.
Yeah.
It's possible to be victimized, for example, as a child, without becoming a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, a lot of folks who walk around with a victim story hanging over their head, limiting them, making them so unhappy, can react badly to that when you say that. Are you saying that what happened to me didn't happen? Absolutely not. But you now have a choice on how you remember this, how you hold it, without denying anything.
Yes.
And that is freedom. Until then, we are the prisoners of our own, we're the prisoners of childhood.
Mm-hmm. And hence why it's so important, right, to also realize the notion that there are parts of the personality that come up to protect. So if we approach that, if we are able to dig the self out from all the parts, And we are able to then have the self approach the parts with compassion. And I think that's your questions also, as difficult as they are wrapped in compassion. Both, when you write and also when you facilitate writings. Will you agree with me that that's?
I do. I do. I think that my own life experience has taught me compassion and empathy. I certainly don't come to my work with any sense that I'm better than or more healed than or superior in any way. There's not a lot of judgment.
Yeah.
And no real healing or transformation happens without compassion.
No.
So when I'm working with students, it's really important for them to understand I'm on their side. My heart is open. I'm rooting for them. And so when they know that, it gives you permission to go to some deep places and say challenging things. And as I was saying earlier, people aren't often asked challenging questions, pointed, penetrating questions. So if you've established a baseline of trust, you can do that. And folks thrive, people flourish. I've had many people say that they had more change in a weekend of doing this kind of writing than they had in 6 months of therapy.
Because
to which I respond, maybe you need to change therapists. but the point is well taken, because therapists are there to guide you. It's a slower unfolding process. This is triage. It goes right to the heart of what's going on. And I'm not trained as an academic. I'm not trained as a therapist. So I come to it just from my life experience. And so I'm not bound by a lot of the criteria and the protocols that a professional therapist is bound by. So I can take real risks that someone like yourself, someone with a doctorate who treats people from that doctor place may not be able to do.
Yeah. So let's go more into what we're talking about, the parts. And you said you're not going at this from the lens of an academic, but you do have read quite a bit, and that is so obvious in the work that you do. So in the chapter about the shadow, you write that if we are able to forget our shadow, life becomes easier, given that our shadow is embedded in so many parts, again, as I would say, or at least that's how I see it, that the shadow is embedded in mostly in the protectors parts. So do you think we can ignore the shadow and pretend, as I was saying before, or
no, on the contrary.
You're looking at me like, what?
No. I never said ignore the shadow. On the contrary, I do a lot of shadow work. And I'm very clear on the fact from my own experience that if you ignore what's in the shadow, both the positive and the negative things, you lose half of who you are. You can't find integration. You can't feel whole if you're suppressing things out of shame or fear or guilt or whatever it happens to be. The important thing, though, is to realize that the shadow also contains your treasure. It also contains your originality, your nonconformity, your uniqueness, the parts of you that you've suppressed because you didn't know how to bring them into your life, or they were too threatening. They're not in themselves negative. In fact, they have your power. And so we need to be willing to look at the parts of ourselves that we suppress and why we suppress them, and how we can integrate the suppressed parts into how we live and how we see ourselves, including the worst of who we are. I find that very, very moving, really. The Roman philosopher Horace said, "Nothing human is foreign to me."
Correct.
When we understand that we contain within us everything, the whole mandala of potential, from the darkest to the lightest, life gets much bigger. It can seem a little threatening at first when you realize, oh gosh, I have the potential for evil. But when you realize that, you get bigger and bigger and less afraid of the things that that you've kind of swept under the rug and tried not to look at.
Yeah. When you look back at your life, can you think of the moment? Can you identify a moment where you saw the shadow? And some people say, well, if you see it, then it's not the shadow. But when you saw a part that that was hidden, and you saw perhaps that there was pain, can you pinpoint, can you open a little bit to a passage in your life that you are comfortable to share, where you can say this was a moment of perhaps breakdown and then breakthrough, where I recognize where, I don't know, evil or whatever. I don't want to put words in your.
Yes, I can. And it's after I came back from India the first time, and I had had some wonderful spiritual experiences, but I wasn't cooked. There was something in me that was really stuck. I was very angry. I was very defended. I had all kinds of feelings that I didn't really understand.
Mhm,
And I was trying to have a relationship.
mhm,
And I found that this rage kept coming up. I found that these terror of being abandoned, all of these things just kept coming up in a huge way that were really preventing me from being happy and being in a relationship. And I went into therapy finally. And
mhm.
I realized in therapy that as someone whose father abandoned me when I was 4 years old, I was not parented, uh, I had a huge issue about being forgotten and being neglected and being pushed out that I had never dealt with. It was in my shadow. Instead, I had put on this kind of brave face.
A bravado.
Yeah, bravado, very, I don't care. But the truth is, I was deeply insecure. And all I had to do was get a little too close to somebody for all of those demons to start coming out. So I needed to open the door and see what was there. Who was this little boy who was manipulating, running my life, really? This wounded child. And I had to look at that child and see it. And I had one really powerful moment when I was imagining this little boy and I saw a door in my mind, closed my eyes. I saw a door open. I saw this little child. Remember those starving kids from Africa, the pictures of it was like that with the big old belly and the starving and the bulging eyes. That's who I was inside. That was this character who was so terrified, like a burn victim. You touch a burn victim and that's what he was like. And if you got any too close to him, he would start acting out. And it took me years. It took me years to really exercise some tenderness toward this little boy, understand who he was, and not let him run my life anymore. That was a major breakthrough for me. It's the only reason that I'm now happily married for 15 years, and it's the only reason why, because I did this piece of work with the shadow.
And I'm imagining that's what led you to write the book. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. All of my books are to figure out something.
Right,
My
right.
books,
One of my teachers, Jack Cornfield, says that love and sex are the most direct ways for us to find, right, those parts of us. First, he says, is the fastest way for us to become stupid in our behaviors, right? Especially sex, but also for us to really tap into those dark places.
no
Either
question.
want it, right? Or because we don't know how to give it, but it puts you there. It puts you in front of the shadow.
Yeah, I agree with Jack. Ramdas used to say, if you want to know how you're doing, just go home and
Go
visit
home
your
and
family. And
yes,
that's one way. But another approach is, if you want to know how you're doing, try having a relationship. Try having an intimate, even if it's a friendship, even if it doesn't include sex. When
yes.
you get vulnerable, when you feel exposed, all the demons come out.
Yeah.
And I agree with Jack. For me, relationship has been a profound path of self-discovery in terms of my own, spirituality as well as psychologically.
Yeah. And, let's stay in that topic because one of the things that, in the training to become a mindfulness meditation teacher, there is a lot of conversation of sexuality and the things that can come up because, once you become a teacher, there is an admiration, right? There is a level of intimacy also that is developed. What are some of your, I don't want to call strategies, but I guess strategies to keep yourself focused as a teacher when people try to elevate you, like you were saying before, you're just a guy who went through a lot, and so his ego and has been looking for ways to soften that ego. So when people try to elevate you beyond your humanness, and perhaps we've seen so many instances, right, of spiritual teachers who get in trouble. Like how do you protect yourself and the ones who work with you?
That's a great question. First of all, because I've been an interviewer and I've worked with very well-known spiritual teachers on books, for example, like Ram Dass, I have seen that from the other side. I've seen people throw themselves at teachers. I've seen the dangers of that.
Mm.
When it comes to myself, honestly, Marianela, I don't take myself that seriously, and I deflect it. I kind of laugh about it. And, I'm flattered if people are getting something out of the teaching, but I really know it's not about me. I
Right,
don't take
right.
it to heart. And because I'm not trying to control anyone and I
Mhm.
don't really need anything from them,
Right.
I'm very careful about my boundaries. For
Yeah.
example, I don't even make friends with students.
Mhm.
Over the years and 15 years teaching, I think I've become friends outside with a couple of people who stopped working with me, but
Mhm.
I'm very clear about my boundaries. I know that I'm there to perform a service.
Mhm.
I understand transference and projection, and I can see when people are falling into that, and I don't take it on.
Mhm.
It's a
Mhm.
little bit like when people say, how can you listen to all of these sometimes quite
Mhm.
dark and painful stories
Mhm.
day after day, for example, on a 5-day retreat like I just did?
Mhm.
It doesn't affect me
Mhm.
because I'm not taking it personally.
Mhm.
A person said to me when I started teaching, keep the back door open. So when stuff
Mhm.
comes at you, let
Mhm.
it move through
It
you.
just goes. Yeah.
And it works.
Yeah.
So I can honestly I say I've only ever had one inappropriate moment with a student who got it in her head that she was,
Gonna get you.
and it got a little messy. It was very early on in my teaching. It got a little messy because I didn't know quite how to respond. It only got messy in the sense that we had to talk about it. It's
Mhm.
the only time that I ever had to talk about it with a student.
Mhm.
Other than that, I'm very clear about my boundaries.
Mhm.
That's not what I'm there for.
Which is, I like what you're saying because it's not a lack of empathy, it's not a lack of compassion, but it goes back to what you were saying. Like if the ego is not, huge, then yeah, it's not about you. The
It's not.
stories are not about you. I mean, as a therapist, that's what allows me to keep sanity because it's not about me, it's not about how capable I am. It's just, do I know how to hold the space? So I think you're
Right.
saying that, yeah. And that I'm imagining with that student, that things got difficult, but I'm imagining was also a way for you to show the student a viable way to remove things from what you call the shadow bag, right?
Yeah. 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 And it didn't work out, and we stopped working together. It just became too messy. And I was glad that we moved on. The thing about teaching is that it's a very humbling experience People think, oh, you're a teacher, you're up there, and people are going to put you on a pedestal. And of course, that does happen sometimes, but inwardly, I find it extremely humbling. Also, folks come to you, they take a taste and they move on. 95% of the people you work with take one class or they come to one workshop and you never see them again. It's very humbling. So one doesn't have the chance to sort of get attached and need them in any way. That's not the nature of the relationship.
Right.
And I'm clear about that. If I wasn't, it would be problematic. For example, I do know somebody who is a teacher who is quite lonely in her life and is a little bit loose with her boundaries with students. And she often gets into complicated, ugly situations that have to terminate because she allowed people.
It's complicated.
Yeah, she allowed people too close into her life and she allowed herself to need them. It wasn't appropriate. And so I've seen it happen. It's a cautionary thing. I've seen it happen to other teachers, and I'm very, very careful for that not to be a problem for me.
Yeah, it definitely. But like you said, when you are giving the workshops and there is a finite time, 5 days, 10 days, and people go, that makes it easier as opposed to, someone like a therapist where you might work with people for years and the boundaries have to be kept so clear. And again, if there is an ego, if there is a part of the therapist that is, too much of a manager, then that's when things get really problematic. One curiosity I have, because you work internationally, you work here, and I just want to pick your brain in terms of working with people from different walks of life, working, with different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds, different sexual identities. Thank God that we're moving more to a time that is not, this binary thing, right? Like we are forced to grow beyond that. How easy is it for you? Is it this again? Do you lean in that I'm not here, I'm just the space, or what do you say? Like how?
I operate on the principle that people are people. And what interests me is the universality of our experience. So the politics of gender, the politics of sexuality, the politics of race, I don't really let enter into the work that I do because I'm speaking to them as human beings first. Not as a Black guy or an Asian woman or a gay person, straight person. That's not what interests me. I'm interested in going to the baseline.
But let's say, Mark, though, that let's say the spiritual arena in this country was primarily white. I remember when I began, I'm talking, I've been in this country for only 30 something years. And when I started visiting, the different centers here, the majority of the time I was one of 100 and that does something to us, right? Like it is hard for the individual that is there shining like in the spotlight, even if you don't want it. Like, let's say someone like me, like I have an accent. I've been in places where there is and I love talking sometimes, even though I'm shy, but I'm like, I have a question. And I remember being in places when they hear my voice, the whole room turns back and boy, do I feel otherized.
Mhm.
right? Because it's like, what happened? You're not turning your head when somebody else is talking. I'm not saying anything extraordinary. So there are these minute things that also as teachers have to, keep in mind. I don't think it's enough to say, I treat everyone as humans. I'm gonna challenge you to think a little bit more.
Yeah, well, you were asking me about my experience and how I approach it. I'm telling you how I approach it.
Uh-huh.
I may not be as politically correct as I might be, but it's never ever been an issue.
Uh-huh.
It has never been a problem.
Mhm.
I ask people, our people, we work on universal themes
Yeah,
of
yeah,
love and death
yeah.
and work and meaning, and they're very unique to the individual. So maybe because I leave plenty of space for
Mhm.
people to express themselves, I'm not looking for particular kinds of answers. Uh,
That's true.
then
That's
it just isn't a problem. I've only had one situation recently where somebody wrote to me asking me for a freebie uh, for one of my workshops, saying that I didn't have enough people of color
uh-huh.
in my workshops, in her opinion,
Uh-huh.
and that it wasn't a good look for me. It was
Uh-huh.
such an interesting moment, and I could feel myself getting defensive. First of all, I have lots of Black and Asian, Chicano.
Right,
I have
right.
a wide variety, but I
Mm,
saw my own reaction to it, and I could feel myself getting a little defensive. And then I was very honest with her, and I said, I have no power over who comes to my workshops. They
mm,
are equal opportunity.
mhm,
I have lots of folks from all kinds of different walks of life, but the work I do is Dharma work.
mm,
It's
mm,
spiritual work. It's
mm,
not political in nature, and
mhm,
it's not that interested in identity. And
mm.
what you're talking about is identity politics, and
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a real emphasis on it these days. It
Mm,
doesn't really interest me,
mm,
and that goes for my own identity. I'm
mm,
interested in my archetypal human experience more than I'm interested in my Judaism,
mm,
or my being a New Yorker, or any other kind of subdivision of who I might be. It just doesn't interest me, particularly when it comes to spirituality and transformational work.
mm,
Some
mm.
people may need to do transformational work around their identity.
Yeah.
I can help them in terms of their own story,
Mm,
but they may need to work with a person of color, or they need to work with
mm,
somebody who is like them. I had an interesting experience of this. I was on a retreat with a great spiritual teacher last year named Rupert Spira up at Guy
yeah.
Garrison Institute.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
there was a Black woman in the group. And she was
mm,
one of maybe only 3 or 4 Black folk in
mm,
group of 100 or more. And she said something to Rupert. She raised her hand and said something along the lines of what you're asking about. Well, what about me as a Black person?
mm.
And he completely redirected the question to, who is the person asking the question? Who is the
Yes.
self that's
Yes.
behind
Yes.
this identity asking the
Right.
question? He didn't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for me, sometimes it does feel like a rabbit hole. I think people need to
It
ask.
can be,
It
it
can be.
can be, it can be, but because it is, I agree with you, it is part of the identity politics conversation, but it is one that we have to have though.
Absolutely. And I'm thrilled that we're having it. I'm
Yeah.
happy about gender,
Mm,
gender non-normative, non-binary. I'm
mm,
thrilled that people are discovering their own unique nature. That's a
mhm,
fantastic thing.
mhm.
But my work doesn't depend on addressing that.
Yeah. No, I think because the self, the authentic self doesn't have hangs up. Those are the parts. So from that perspective, yes, totally agree with you. Oh my God, Mark, I have so many questions and we don't have a lot of time. Let me think. I wanted for you to address a little bit how, maybe this is the last question, how the issue of embodiment. There is a beautiful portion of your book in terms of trauma and addressing memories and how our body stores memories at the cellular level. And I know that writing, as someone who works with embodied writing, that there is a kind of writing that we can do to activate memories. So I guess there are two parts to my question. What do you do when trauma gets heavily activated in a class? Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that.
Well, the first thing I do is explain that the purpose of the work is not to dive into trauma.
Mhm,
It's to write about it from who we are today.
mhm.
So it's the difference between throwing yourself down the well and leaning over the well with a flashlight and exploring.
Yeah, yeah.
Having said that, when people are triggered by the writing anyway, when it brings up trauma, and it does sometimes, I encourage them to look at the story around the trauma. Now, as you were saying, there are parts of trauma that are about the body. They're physical. They can't be helped through writing. They can't be helped through talk therapy. They need somatic work and release. And there are people who are severely traumatized who can't do the work that I do. But the vast majority find that when I suggest looking at the story in a different way, that is actually very liberating. When they understand that I'm not trying to take their experience away or deny their experience in any way, but I'm saying, you've spent 50 years looking at yourself as an abused person. What would it take and how would it change if you looked at yourself as someone who was abused in the past? That is a
That's
huge
fantastic.
difference.
Yes.
I am an abused person. That becomes your identity versus this happened to me. Completely different. And it's very, very liberating for people.
And empowering.
It's very empowering. It's extremely empowering because you realize that your past doesn't have to dictate the rest of your life.
And the beauty in doing this kind of writing, right? Healing, writing that is healing, is that we are aiming, right, at facilitating this degree of separation.
Yes.
From
Yes.
From what happened. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So you can say that happened, that hurt. Sometimes I get triggered and feelings come up to which I can be tender and understanding without letting them run my life. What happens with a lot of people I've seen is that their emotions take over everything. And they have this idea that emotion is always right. So if they're feeling it, it must be true. And so they become beholden to the weather of their emotions. That's a terrible way to live because our emotions are constantly changing and doing all kinds of things that are more, that are quite arbitrary.
Right.
So letting it be what it is, being sensitive toward it without over investing it with importance.
Right.
That's what I recommend doing with story in general. And things that have happened to us in the past. We have a choice, as we were just talking about how we hold that.
Absolutely. So before we end, give us a preview into what's coming. What's the book that it's in the oven?
Oh, thank you. Well, I have just finished this very week a book I've been working on for the last 3 years about Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is an American spiritual teacher, and he was my original love he was the first philosopher I fell in love with. So it's a book about my relationship to Ralph Waldo Emerson, how his wisdom has changed me, what we don't understand about self-reliance, which was his central teaching, and about transcendentalism in general. He was the first transcendentalist teacher in the United States, and we don't understand how much transcendentalism affects the American dream and how we see ourselves as Americans. So I've tried to create a book that it's part memoir, it's part study of his work, it's part social commentary, but really the heart of it is that we that God is within us, that we are a part of God, that there is no God outside there, which was for him the big thing. He had to leave the church, and he was exiled from society in certain ways because of that belief. It's a radical belief. But for me, when I read it, when I was in my 20s, it shook me up.
Uh-huh.
And I was agnostic at the time, kind of an atheist agnostic at the time. But when I read him saying that self-reliance is reliance on God, it just spoke to me. It resonated with me. I knew it was true. And so this book is an exploration of how I knew it was true and what people can learn from his extraordinary body of work.
Wow, I can't wait. And you know what? You have to promise me a conversation, because what I'm thinking is I want us to have a conversation between the influence of Mother Mira in your life. And I mean, we have to have that
I
conversation.
would love to. I would love
I
to.
mean, talking about integration, right? You have
Yes, yes.
mother, and then you have this archetype. I don't want to say of masculinity, but I think there's a lot of that in Emerson, right? So
There is. He was not
promise me that
masculine,
we're gonna have
not macho. No, he was
no,
the
no,
last thing from macho. But
no,
yes,
no, but
he was
masculine.
my image
Mhm.
of what a man could be,
Correct,
what a seer
right?
could be, a wise man could be.
Like healthy masculinity, and then you have the great mother here. So you have to promise me that we're gonna have that conversation at some point.
It's a deal. I would love to.
I haven't I haven't read your book on Mother Mira, so I'm gonna start reading it. So when the other one comes out, then I go with that. So thank you, Mark. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want the audience to know?
Not at all, other than the fact that I have a group called the Seekers Forum that is an online self-inquiry and spirituality group, non-sectarian, and we have weekly guided writing sessions that I run. So if folks would like to join us or check us out at theseekersforum.com, we would love to have you.
Beautiful. Can they also get information if they go to the markmatousek.com?
Yes, you can also just go to my website, markmatousek.com, and there is information there about the Seekers Forum as well as my workshops and classes.
Beautiful. Thank you so, so much, Mark.
Thank you, Marianela. So good to see you.
Yes, and thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access today's interview at Anchor, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you are interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And also, if you found our program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion, always, always.